So today I want to talk about the single most underappreciated danger in the current global situation. Not the weapons, not the sanctions, not the troop movements, or the diplomatic failures, or the political divisions. Something more fundamental than all of those. The danger of miscalculation. The danger that one major actor in one critical moment reads the situation incorrectly, makes a decision based on that incorrect reading, and triggers a sequence of events that nobody intended and nobody can quickly reverse. Everyone is covering the things that have already happened, the strikes that have already landed, the sanctions that have already been imposed, the statements that have already been made. The coverage is focused entirely on the visible, the measurable, the already occurred. But almost nobody is asking the question that actually matters most to ordinary people. Not, what has already gone wrong, but what is the one error, the one moment of misread intelligence, misunderstood intent, or misjudged resolve that could transform a managed conflict into something that threatens your energy supply, your savings, your job, your family's safety, and the entire framework of international stability that ordinary people depend on without realizing it. The answer, when you look at it carefully, is that the margin for error in the current situation is thinner than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Not because any single actor wants catastrophe, none of them do, but because the system in which they are operating has so many pressure points, so many tripwires, and so many actors whose calculations depend on assumptions about each other's behavior that may not be accurate, that a single wrong assessment at a critical moment could initiate a cascade that no one intended, and that everyone, once inside it, would struggle to stop. If you are not subscribed yet, please hit like and subscribe now. This channel exists to explain exactly this kind of structural risk in simple English so ordinary people understand what the headlines are not telling them. 2 seconds. It matters. So today I want to walk you through exactly what a miscalculation looks like, where the most dangerous ones are currently forming, and what they mean for every major actor in this conflict. So let us begin. History's worst conflicts were almost never started by leaders who wanted catastrophe. They were started by leaders who made a specific, identifiable error in reasoning, and that error almost always took the same form. They correctly assessed their own strength, their own resolve, and their own willingness to pay a cost. And they then incorrectly projected those same qualities onto the other side. They assumed the adversary would calculate the situation the same way they did. They assumed that what seemed rational to them would seem rational to the other side. That assumption proved to be wrong. And the wrongness of that assumption is what produced the catastrophe. The clearest example in modern history is the decision by Japan's leadership to attack Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Japan's military planners were not irrational. They understood that Japan could not win a prolonged industrial war against the United States. Their calculation was different. They believed that a devastating surprise strike on the American Pacific Fleet would so shock the American public and so demonstrate American vulnerability that Washington would negotiate a settlement rather than absorb the cost of a full Pacific War. They were assessing American resolve through the lens of their own strategic logic, and they were catastrophically wrong. America did not negotiate. It mobilized, and 4 years later, Japan's cities were in ashes. The second example is Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany in August 1914, which believed that mobilizing for war against France and Russia would convince Britain to stay out of the conflict, because British strategic interests in a continental balance of power, which should have been obvious to any careful analyst, were somehow not weighted heavily enough in the German calculation. Britain entered the war within days of the German invasion of Belgium. The miscalculation cost Germany the war and the Kaiser his throne. The question is no longer whether miscalculations cause catastrophic outcomes. History has demonstrated this with a consistency that should concentrate every serious analyst's attention. The question is where the most dangerous active miscalculations are forming right now, in the current conflict, in the current configuration of pressures, with the current set of actors who are each operating inside their own framework of assumptions that the other side may not share. The answer to that question depends entirely on one analytical tool: the gap between what each actor believes about the other's resolve and what that resolve actually is. The wider that gap on any side, the more dangerous the miscalculation risk becomes. Let me walk you through every major actor and the specific gap that most concerns me about each one. On the surface, Russia's leadership appears to have absorbed the failure of its initial miscalculations in February 2022 and adjusted its strategy accordingly. It no longer expects a rapid military victory. It has shifted to an attrition strategy. It has mobilized additional forces. It has restructured its economy for sustained war production. And it has recalibrated its public messaging from a special military operation that would end in days to a long-term conflict framed as an existential confrontation with the West. The adjustment from a certain angle looks like pragmatic realism. On the surface, Russia's leadership appears to be operating from an accurate assessment of the situation. But here is the specific miscalculation that is currently forming and that most analysis is underweighting. Russia's leadership has drawn from the last 3 years of conflict a conclusion that is coherent within its own framework, but potentially catastrophically wrong in its implications. That conclusion is this: the West will not risk direct military confrontation with a nuclear power regardless of how far Russia pushes. The evidence Russia's leadership cites for this conclusion is substantial. NATO has not intervened directly despite years of Ukrainian requests. Western governments have repeatedly drawn red lines and then redrawn them further back when Russia approached them. Nuclear rhetoric has produced caution in Western capitals every single time it has been deployed. From inside Moscow's analytical framework, the lesson of this conflict is that nuclear deterrence gives Russia a de facto permission structure to take actions that would otherwise trigger direct Western military response. That conclusion may be correct within certain boundaries, but the specific miscalculation risk is that Russia applies it to a situation where the boundaries it believes exist do not actually exist in the way it has assessed them. If Russia conducts an action against a NATO member's infrastructure, against a supply line on NATO territory, against a vessel carrying Western military equipment, that it believes falls below the threshold of direct military response, and that Western governments have actually determined does cross a threshold they will respond to. The gap between those two assessments is where catastrophe lives. The consequence chain is direct and rapid. Russia takes an action it believes is safely below the Western response threshold. Western governments face a domestic and alliance internal political crisis in which doing nothing is assessed as more damaging to long-term deterrence credibility than responding. A response is ordered. Russia must then decide whether to treat that response as an isolated escalation or as evidence that its assessment of the Western resolve threshold was wrong. If Russia escalates further rather than pausing, the ratchet turns in a direction that very few decision-makers on any side have genuinely planned for. For ordinary Russian families, this miscalculation risk is the most personally threatening of any in this analysis. A Russia that pushes past the actual Western response threshold is a Russia that has initiated a direct military confrontation with the most powerful military alliance in history. The nuclear deterrent that its leadership is relying on as a permission structure would then become something far more immediate and far more dangerous than a rhetorical instrument. The families who would pay the price of that transition would not be the leaders who made the miscalculation. They would be ordinary people who had no meaningful voice in the decision. Now let us look at the mirror image of this miscalculation on the Western side. On the surface, the United States has presented a picture of consistent, measured resolve throughout this conflict. It has provided enormous quantities of military and financial assistance. It has led the coordination of Western sanctions. It has expanded NATO's eastern flank. It has maintained its Article 5 commitments credibly. And it has calibrated its support for Ukraine carefully to avoid direct military confrontation with Russia while maximizing Ukraine's ability to defend itself. On the surface, American resolve looks clear, coherent, and consistently communicated. But here is the specific miscalculation risk that the surface picture is concealing. The United States is communicating its resolve to two audiences simultaneously, and what it is communicating to each is subtly but importantly different. To its allies and to Ukraine, it is communicating unwavering commitment. To Russia, it is attempting to communicate a combination of resolve and restraint. Resolve about core commitments, restraint about escalation, that is designed to deter further Russian aggression while preserving the diplomatic space for an eventual settlement. The problem is that this dual communication has produced a signal that Russia is interpreting through its own framework, and that interpretation is producing the conclusion I described in the Russia section. That American restraint reflects a structural unwillingness to risk direct confrontation, not a deliberate and limited choice about proportionality. The specific resolve gap that most concerns serious analysts is this. American domestic political support for sustained engagement in Ukraine has fallen by approximately 23 percentage points from its 2022 peak. Congressional delays on aid packages have stretched into months. The political movement most skeptical of foreign commitments has gained significant electoral ground. And the signals these domestic developments send to Russia, signals of a democracy whose public is tiring of the commitment, are being read in Moscow as evidence that the restraint will eventually become permanent withdrawal, which reduces the urgency of any settlement from Russia's perspective. The consequence chain from this resolve gap is the mirror image of the Russian miscalculation. If Russia concludes that American domestic political pressure will eventually produce a significant reduction in support for Ukraine, it has an incentive to continue the conflict until that reduction materializes, rather than seeking a settlement at current terms. If that conclusion is wrong, if American political will reconsolidates around sustained support at a moment when Russia has committed further to the conflict on the basis of its assessment, Russia finds itself in a position it had not planned for and must make decisions under conditions it did not anticipate. For ordinary American families, this resolve gap matters in a specific and personal way. The political debate about Ukraine support is not abstract. It is a debate about how much of their country's resources, attention, and strategic credibility to commit to a conflict whose duration and outcome remain uncertain. Getting that debate right, neither overcommitting nor undercommitting relative to what the situation actually requires, is one of the most consequential policy challenges the United States has faced since the end of the Cold War. And the domestic political dynamics that are shaping it are not always producing clarity. Now let us look at the actor whose miscalculation risk is the most consequential of all in the long term. On the surface, China has maintained its position of studied ambiguity with remarkable discipline. It has not sent weapons to Russia. It has called for peace. It has maintained trade with both sides. And it has consistently presented itself as a responsible great power that is above the conflict and capable of playing a constructive mediating role. Chinese officials have been careful in every public statement to avoid the kind of explicit alignment that would trigger secondary sanctions from Western governments or definitively close the door to any remaining diplomatic relationship with Ukraine's Western partners. On the surface, China looks like the most strategically disciplined actor in the entire situation. But here is the calculation that is being made in Beijing right now, in real time, and that represents the most consequential miscalculation risk in the entire global system. China's leadership is watching this conflict as a data collection exercise on Western resolve, Western military capacity, Western alliance cohesion, and Western willingness to absorb economic pain in defense of a stated principle. Every piece of data it is collecting is being filtered through the specific question that matters most to Beijing's strategic planners. What would the Western response to a Taiwan contingency actually look like, as opposed to what Western governments say it would look like? The gap between those two things, between stated Western resolve over Taiwan and the demonstrated Western behavior in response to the Ukrainian conflict, is the measurement China's analysts are most intensively making. The specific risk is that China draws the wrong conclusion from the right data. The data it is observing, Western restraint, delayed aid packages, political division, reduced public support, genuinely reflects real constraints on Western capacity. But those constraints have limits that are not clearly visible in the data China is observing. The Western Alliance's commitment to Taiwan's de facto independence is, for reasons that include both security architecture and semiconductor supply chain dependency, considerably more structural than its commitment to Ukrainian territorial integrity. A China that extrapolates from Western behavior in Ukraine to Western behavior in a Taiwan contingency may be making the same category of error that Japan made in 1941, assuming that what appears rational and coherent in its own strategic framework will appear equally rational and coherent to the adversary it is trying to deter. The consequence chain from a Chinese miscalculation over Taiwan is the most economically devastating scenario available in the current global environment. Taiwan produces approximately 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. A military disruption of that production, whether through conflict, blockade, or the threat of either, would produce an immediate supply shock to every economy on Earth that depends on advanced chips. Every car, every smartphone, every hospital diagnostic system, every modern weapons platform, every data, years is not a headline. It has not been discussed in a single primetime broadcast in any Western country in the last year. And yet it is the structural condition that makes every other miscalculation in this analysis more dangerous than it would otherwise be. Now let us look at the final actor, and the one whose miscalculation is most directly within ordinary people's own sphere of influence. On the surface, Western democratic institutions have demonstrated a resilience in managing this conflict that has genuinely surprised many analysts. Despite significant internal political pressures, despite the economic costs of sanctions and energy transition, despite the electoral gains of parties skeptical of international commitments, the core institutional architecture of the Western Alliance has held. NATO has expanded, military assistance has continued, the sanctions framework has been maintained, and the international legal and institutional frameworks, the International Criminal Court, the UN General Assembly votes, the multilateral financial institution responses, have all continued to function at a level that reflects meaningful, if imperfect, Western institutional cohesion. On the surface, Western institutions look like they have passed a serious stress test. But here is the specific miscalculation that Western institutional actors are making, and that represents the most slowly developing but ultimately most consequential risk in this analysis. Western institutions are operating on the assumption that public patience with the costs of this conflict is essentially elastic, that the populations of democratic countries, if their governments explain the stakes clearly enough and maintain the moral case for continued commitment forcefully enough, will continue to absorb economic pain, defense spending increases, and geopolitical instability for as long as the situation requires. This assumption is not entirely wrong. Democracies have sustained much longer and much costlier commitments in the past, but it understates the specific conditions under which democratic patience frays fastest, and those conditions are currently present in almost every major Western democracy simultaneously. The specific conditions that erode democratic patience for foreign commitments most reliably are three. First, economic pain that is concentrated in the most politically volatile demographic groups. Second, a narrative gap, the absence of a clear, honest explanation from governments about how the current costs connect to a specific achievable goal with a specific achievable endpoint. Third, the availability of a credible political alternative that offers relief from the costs without requiring engagement with the strategic logic of why those costs are being paid. All three conditions are currently present. The energy and inflation costs have fallen most heavily on working class and lower middle class households. The narrative gap between the costs of engagement and the articulation of what success looks like has never been adequately closed by any major Western government. And the political movements offering relief from those costs have grown in electoral credibility across almost every major Western democracy. The consequence chain from this institutional miscalculation is the slowest moving, but ultimately the most structurally dangerous in the entire analysis. If Western institutions misread the elasticity of democratic patience and fail to build the political case for sustained engagement before that patience reaches its limit, they will find themselves managing a credibility crisis, a moment when their stated commitments exceed their demonstrated capacity to honor them, that is more damaging to long-term deterrence than any single military setback. Adversaries who observe that Western democratic systems cannot sustain commitments past a certain economic pain threshold have a roadmap for eroding those commitments without direct military confrontation. That roadmap does not require a single shot to be fired. For ordinary families in Western democracies, this is the miscalculation that sits most directly within their own sphere of influence. The gap between institutional assumptions about democratic patience and the actual state of democratic patience is a gap that ordinary people can help close. By demanding honest answers about costs and goals, by engaging with the strategic logic rather than reacting to the economic pain alone, and by recognizing that their own political choices are being watched and interpreted by adversaries who are specifically calculating how much those choices can be exploited. That is not a comfortable thing to say, but it is the honest thing to say. So now let us zoom out and look at the biggest picture of all. Because what I have been describing, Russia's compounding miscalculation about Western response thresholds, America's resolve gap and its unintended signal to Moscow, China's real-time extrapolation from Ukraine to Taiwan, the degradation of nuclear communication infrastructure, and Western institutions' overestimation of democratic patience, these are not 5 separate, independent risks sitting in different parts of the global system. They are 5 manifestations of the same underlying problem. And that problem has a name. The problem is the collapse of shared situational awareness. During the Cold War, the 2 superpowers developed an elaborate and expensive infrastructure specifically designed to ensure that both sides had an accurate picture of the other's capabilities, intentions, and red lines. That infrastructure was imperfect. It failed on several critical occasions. The Cuban Missile Crisis itself was partly a product of intelligence failures and misread signals. But the infrastructure existed, was maintained, and was continuously improved through hard-won experience, formal treaties, and the recognition by both sides that the cost of getting it wrong was civilizational. Much of that infrastructure is now gone. The treaties have expired or been abandoned. The communication channels have been reduced or suspended. The academic and policy community that developed a shared vocabulary for discussing deterrence has fragmented along political lines in ways that make common understanding harder to reach. And the information environment in which all parties are operating has been transformed by social media, by state-sponsored disinformation, and by the systematic erosion of the shared factual baseline that rational deterrence depends on. In this environment, the gap between what each actor believes about the other's resolve and what that resolve actually is has become wider, less well-measured, and less reliably correctable than at any point in the nuclear era. And here is the crucial insight that most people are completely missing. Catastrophic miscalculations do not happen because leaders are irrational. They happen because rational leaders, operating inside their own accurate assessment of their own situation, make incorrect inferences about how their adversary is processing the same information. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was rational within Japan's own framework. Germany's 1914 mobilization was rational within its own framework. The confidence with which both sets of leaders pursued their catastrophic choices was a product of intelligence failure, mirror imaging, and the human tendency to assume that what seems obvious from one perspective will seem equally obvious from another. None of those cognitive failures are less present in the current situation than they were in 1914 or 1941. In several important ways, the conditions that produce them are more present. The missile falls in one city, but the miscalculation that fired it was formed in another city entirely, inside a framework of assumptions that nobody on the receiving end shared. The financial shock lands in the pension fund of a family in a country thousands of miles from the origin of the error. The food price spike reaches the household that has no knowledge of the intelligence failure that set it in motion. That is how miscalculations travel, not along the paths their originators intended, along every path where the system is connected and the conditions are ready. I want to end with the most surprising conclusion of this entire analysis. Because after everything I have described, the 5 active miscalculation risks, the degraded communication infrastructure, the collapse of shared situational awareness, and the historical pattern of rational leaders producing catastrophic outcomes, you might expect me to say that the situation is essentially beyond management. That miscalculation at this level of complexity, with this many actors and this many gaps in mutual understanding, is effectively inevitable. You might expect me to say that the collapse is coming and nothing can stop it. But actually, no. The surprise is that the most effective tool available for reducing miscalculation risk is neither military nor diplomatic. It is epistemic. It is the quality and the honesty of the information that decision-makers on all sides are working from. And that tool is more available right now than the current situation might suggest. Here's what I mean. Every catastrophic miscalculation in history was ultimately rooted in a failure of information. Not always the absence of information. Often its presence, but its misinterpretation. Germany in 1914 had information about British strategic interests in the continental balance of power. It interpreted that information incorrectly because its analytical framework filtered it through assumptions that Britain would prioritize its trade relationship with Germany over its strategic interests in preventing German hegemony on the continent. Japan in 1941 had information about American industrial capacity and American public opinion. It interpreted that information incorrectly because it assumed that industrial capacity translated into political will for a prolonged Pacific War, when the opposite was true. The information was available. The framework for interpreting it was wrong. The implication is this. The primary tool for reducing miscalculation risk is not adding more weapons, not imposing more sanctions, not issuing more warnings. It is improving the quality of the interpretive frameworks that decision-makers use to process the information they already have. And the way to improve those frameworks is honest, rigorous, uncomfortable analysis that challenges assumptions rather than confirming them. Think of it this way. A bridge engineer who is calculating the load a bridge can carry does not assume the bridge wants to hold. They measure the actual material strength, the actual stress distribution, and the actual load being applied, and they compare those measurements against known tolerances. The engineer who assumes the bridge will hold because it has always held before is the engineer whose bridge fails when the conditions change. The current global situation is a bridge carrying more load than it has carried for 80 years. The engineers need to be measuring, not assuming. And the most useful contribution that any informed citizen, journalist, analyst, or policymaker can make right now is to insist on measurement rather than assumption. That is not pessimism. That is the only form of optimism that has ever actually worked. So let us just recap what we covered today. The single most underappreciated danger in the current global situation is not any specific weapon, sanction, or political development. It is miscalculation. The process by which rational leaders, operating from accurate assessments of their own situations, make incorrect inferences about their adversaries' resolve, red lines, and likely responses. History's worst conflicts were almost never started by leaders who wanted catastrophe. They were started by leaders who wanted something achievable and made a specific error about how the other side would respond to their pursuit of it. Russia's compounding miscalculation is the belief that demonstrated Western restraint reflects a structural and permanent unwillingness to risk direct confrontation, rather than a deliberate and reversible choice about proportionality. If Russia acts on that belief, at a point where Western governments have actually determined a threshold has been crossed, the gap between those two assessments is where the most acute near-term danger lives. America's resolve gap is the divergence between the unwavering commitment it communicates to its allies and the more ambiguous signal its domestic political debates are sending to Moscow. Russia is reading the domestic debates. It is drawing conclusions about long-term American commitment that may be incorrect, and those incorrect conclusions are reducing its incentive to seek a settlement. China is conducting a real-time data collection exercise on Western resolve. using the Ukrainian conflict as a proxy measurement of what a Taiwan contingency response would look like. The risk is that it extrapolates from Western behavior in Ukraine, where commitment is real but constrained, to Western behavior over Taiwan, where the structural commitments are considerably more binding, and the semiconductor dependency makes the stakes orders of magnitude higher. Nuclear signaling is operating through degraded communication infrastructure. The arms control treaties, military-to-military channels, and shared technical vocabulary that managed nuclear risk for 50 years have been largely dismantled. In a crisis moment, the precision and credibility of the signals that would prevent escalation are less reliable than at any point in the nuclear era. Western institutions are miscalculating the elasticity of democratic patience, operating on the assumption that public tolerance for costs can be maintained indefinitely without a clearer narrative connecting those costs to an achievable, specific goal. That assumption is being tested, and the political movements exploiting the gap between costs and narrative are growing across every major Western democracy. And the surprise conclusion is that the most effective tool available for reducing all 5 of these miscalculation risks is not military, diplomatic, or financial. It is epistemic. It is the quality and honesty of the analytical frameworks that decision-makers are using. Measurement, not assumption. Honest assessment of what the other side actually believes, rather than what it would believe if it reasoned the same way. That is the bridge engineering approach applied to geopolitics, and it is the only approach that has ever reliably prevented catastrophe from the inside. If this gave you a clearer picture of where the most dangerous miscalculations are currently forming, and why improving the quality of analysis is more urgent than adding more weapons or sanctions, please like this video and subscribe. This channel exists to explain structural risks in simple English so ordinary people can understand what the daily headlines are not conveying. 2 seconds. It makes a genuine difference. And tell me in the comments, which of the 5 miscalculation risks do you think is most likely to trigger the collapse? Russia's threshold error, China's Taiwan extrapolation, the nuclear signaling breakdown, or the failure of Western institutional patience? I want to hear what you think. I will see you next time.